Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 10th chapter. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted by much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. But one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." The word of the Lord. You may be seated. You know, as I was working through the first lesson, I realized that we should have started off by saying Abraham. That story was about Abraham and Sarah. You just become so. I've become so familiar with the Bible that, of course, I know exactly where that is and that sort of thing. But anyway, wonderful passage there, and also Colossians is a wonderful passage as well. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about this passage. Why? Because this passage closes out the section from the past few weeks. This is the fourth passage in 4 weeks. And what's interesting about this passage, as well as the three previous passages, they're all about discipleship. Many of you might have thought I was just lazy and left the same image on the front of the bulletin the past few weeks. No, these are all about discipleship and what you should know about being disciples. And many of us ask questions about how can I be a good Christian, for instance, when the real question is, what is the path of discipleship? And here, it's wonderful. Jesus has been laying it out. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that as we go on. So I want to start off by talking about this passage, which is probably more relevant today than when Jesus spoke it in many ways. And that's an amazing thing to me about the Bible. It has this relevancy to our lives today because people really don't change. People can change individually, but people wrestle with the same problems, just maybe a new face on them. Years ago, in my freshman year of college, I got into a little bit of trouble. I was so focused on all the different classes and all the different courses I was taking and getting things just right, I was pulled in all sorts of directions, and I ended up putting a lot of things off until the last time, which is always my temptation, is I want to wait until things are perfect before I go ahead and do them, and that never comes. So at the end of one of my terms, I had 4 major papers, were about 10 pages each, staring me down to complete in just 6 weeks. I phoned home, and my father gave me the same advice that he always gave me when I got into these particular incidents during crunch time. Just take it one step, one day at a time. Now I did just that. I was able to get everything done with just a very few late nights. And I'm sure if we haven't been in that particular situation, we've all had a situation like that. All the deadlines seem to be coming due. We feel the weight of the world on our shoulders, and all this pressure is just coming down on us at all times. And it seems like the funny thing that people mention is with every new technology that's supposed to save us time, what happens? We just find some new use for that new technology, so we have less time than we used to. We used to be at the mercy of the telephone, and now we have the telephone with us at all times. And I am also certain of another thing. I am also certain that in many ways the story of Martha and Mary is getting worse. Because in addition to this new technology that's always always hear we have an increase of distractions in our lives. Music played in grocery stores even, something to distract us. We can't stand silence. And then on top of all of this, we feel out of touch with the people that we're trying to please sometimes, don't we? Sometimes we don't even know who our bosses are. We work for businesses that are larger, and so we don't know, and so they measure by results, and so we focus on our results. It's easy to look at this passage, and we can smile indulgently at Jesus and Mary in their nice, restful discussions. And we can say, well, what a nice story. And then we simply go about our lives having demonstrated that we took absolutely none of it very seriously at all, which is the worst danger that we Christians can have. Christ came to earth to die for us, but while he was here, in addition to that, in addition to this gift of atonement and being in the presence of God, he actually sat and he told us what God thinks of life. Many of us wish we had an instruction manual, and yet we do, if we just listen to the words of Christ. This passage, which finishes up 4 stories of discipleship in Luke, the stories of the unwilling disciples, the sending out of the 70, the lawyer and the merciful Samaritan, shows how discipleship is built not upon our distracted pursuits, but rather in listening to Christ. Listening to the voice of Christ as he speaks to us. We find that busyness leads to a lack of involvement, resentment, and finally purposelessness. A lack of involvement, resentment, and purposelessness. And now the story starts off, interestingly enough, as Jesus is being entertained by women. And it's so, we take it for granted and we just skip over this part, but it's interesting. We're told that Martha has invited him into her house. Now think about this. This is not 21st century America. This is 1st century Judea. And women did not have these kind of privileges. And yet here she is inviting this teacher into her house. And here he is accepting that invitation. So Martha has some understanding that this one is different. This person, this rabbi, is different because he sees her as a human being and not just a second-class citizen. This was something that was not normal in Jesus' day. In it, we can think many things are starting off pretty well, and then we hear that Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. Now, this is important, and again, this is a part of the passage that often gets overlooked. But the phrase to sit at someone's feet, we hear this later on when Paul is talking in the book of Acts, and he says he sat at the feet of Gamaliel, the great Jewish teacher. What that means is he is a disciple. And so what Luke is saying here is that Mary has chosen, she has chosen to be a disciple of Jesus. And here's the thing, Jesus is letting her. Now, this is something very unique. They say, that we don't really realize this, but the interesting thing about Christianity is it is open to everyone who puts their faith in Jesus Christ and trusts in him alone. And that means that into this very male-dominated society, very male-dominated world, Jesus is telling women that they are children of God as well, and they are disciples here, called to be disciples here. But Martha, what's interesting though, Martha doesn't get this. Martha is distracted, we're told, with much service. The Greek, however, is really interesting. Because we know from it, we learn from reading the Greek, that her intent is to be a good hostess. Yet we've all met those hosts and hostesses who are so anxious about making sure everything is going right that everyone has a much worse time than if they would have just not bothered so much. They begin to nag and they begin to apologize and they point out every little flaw that no one would have noticed anyway, so that everyone's on pins and needles and just as anxious and nervous. And so we hear Martha's thoughts that she is feeling this way too, and she is being pulled about. It's worth noting that the Bible is emphatic that she is serving. The word here is the same word we use that we get the word deacon from. She is serving or ministering to them. More on that later. She then believes that Mary should do the same kind of ministry that she is doing. Up until this moment, Jesus has been content to allow herself to drive herself mad with worries. The Greek word for this distraction, perispao, really means to be pulled away. She's being pulled in this direction, in that direction. And isn't that just the way we feel when we're driven by our worries? We're pulled, we feel like we're in some sort of riptide and we're being carried out this way and that, places we don't want to go, drugged behind. Worried people do this, have this kind of reaction so often, don't they? They are pulled this way and that, and they attempt then, just like someone caught in a riptide, to pull others away into this worry as well. Worried people need to be calm, and so when we are calming presence to their worry, we help them, but you have to, anyone who has dealt with someone anxious and worried knows that they're also trying to drag you along too in their own path. And again, worried people also begrudge others who happen to be at peace. We are such anxious people, concerned with doing that, with this, that we focus on the verbs rather than what Jesus is really talking about. You know, Luther says, "For in our age the temptation to presumption besets many, especially those who try with all their might to be just and good without knowing the righteousness of God, which is most bountifully and freely given us in Christ. They try to do good of themselves in order that they might stand before God clothed in their own virtues and merits. But this is impossible. While you were here," he talks to his friend, "this is what we tried to teach you." You know, as we read through this, we see that Martha is going down the path of that certain lawyer that we read last week in the Good Samaritan, who stood up and said, you know, what do I have to do? And then who's my neighbor? And then was grudgingly stated that it was the person who showed mercy rather than the person who tried to save themselves by their own good works or prestige. And Martha is going down that same path, and Jesus sees that in her, and he finally hears her confess that, and into that confession, then Jesus speaks. For Martha, the goal is to make sure every small thing is in order, to cover all the bases, or at least to look like she's covering all the bases. For Mary, the goal, though, was to sit at the Master's feet and just listen. I'm not very good at prayer. I should confess that to you. There are things I feel confident in, and there are things where I need a lot of work. And prayer is one of them. And it's not so much that I don't have a laundry list to give God. It's that prayer is a dialogue, and I should be listening to God. Now, I know a lot of us live in this age of distraction. And many of us remember a time where things could be silent and quiet, but slowly the noise crept in, didn't it? And so we live in an age more and more distraction, so that silence is harder to attain, but more beautiful when it is attained. And God speaks in the silence. Remember a few weeks ago we talked about Elijah on the mountaintop? Remember what happened to him? The noise came, earthquake, and the storm. But it was in that whisper of the cool breeze, silence, that he heard God's voice. And so we must be open to listening to God and not just talking to him. You know, what happens here, though? Jesus corrects her. Martha has been uninvolved with learning from Christ, from listening to Christ. She has been resentful, indeed, of those who are not pulled by their busyness, by her busyness. And she has forgotten what her true purpose should be, to be a disciple. And so we should come back to that word ministering that we had here. Are we really ministering? Or are we simply just keeping busy? There's a big difference. Are we ministering? Or are we simply keeping up appearances? These are important questions for us to ask. Indeed, people who are called to be ministers need to ask these questions. But we're all called to be ministers in one way or the other. And we're told not to resent people whose ministry may look different, may be different than our own. Rather, we are to be open to listening to the voice of Christ through the Holy Spirit, of what they're called to do, so that we can help them and they can help us. But most importantly, we are called to listen. Listen at the feet. To be a disciple is to listen to Christ and not be drugged this way and that with the cares of the world. Whether you are a student burning the midnight oil, a hostess desperately trying to make a good impression, or a disciple caught in a distractible age, Christ's statement for you is the same. We must sit at his feet, and we must listen. Martha chose to listen to all of the voices, all of the clamor, and she could never find a fixed point. Mary chose the greater portion, greater thing. And so this is what the story is really about. It is the choice of whether we will listen to all of the distractions, or we will hone in on the one voice that can give us life.